In 1903, New York had a problem. The streets were dirty. The cops were overwhelmed. The politicians were crooked. And somewhere in Little Italy, Giuseppe Morello was handing out counterfeit money like coupons at a damn grocery store. Introducing the Morello family, America's original crime starter kit. Why struggle honestly when you can extort bakers, counterfeit currency, and threaten horse owners like a professional psychopath? Need protection? Need intimidation? Need a mysterious Sicilian guy with one functional finger staring at you from across the street? The Morellos got you covered. Features include free black hand letters, complimentary threats against your family business, counterfeit cash fresh off the press, random shotgun murders in broad daylight, one emotionally unstable guy named Lupo screaming at wholesalers. Order now and receive one complimentary barrel left in the middle of the street, because nothing says organized crime like traumatizing innocent civilians before sunrise. But wait, there's more. Tired of annoying witnesses? Try our revolutionary Omertan silence system term. If somebody talks to the police, they disappear faster than rent money in Little Italy. Side effects may include fear, paranoia, extortion, knife fights, federal indictments, and mysterious barrel-related incidents. And remember, before Vegas, before The Godfather, before Hollywood turned these lunatics into legends, there was Giuseppe Morello, a one-handed psychopath with a printing press and absolutely zero chill. Larry, the Morello family, to counterfeiting the American dream since 1899. Disclaimer. This documentary is intended for commentary, historical discussion, analysis, satire, and entertainment purposes only. No statement in this documentary should be interpreted as a formal accusation of criminal conduct beyond what has been historically documented, publicly reported, or discussed through historical records. This production explores the origins of organized crime in America through historical storytelling, archived accounts, and documented events. Viewer discretion is advised.
A Pizzaverse Studios production, in association with Palermo Productions. Written by Bambi Palermo. Narrated by Vincent DiPrio. The real history of the Italian Mafia. Before the Commission. Before Lucky Luciano. Before the five families ruled New York, there was Giuseppe Morello, a one-handed Sicilian immigrant from Corleone who stepped onto American soil carrying old-world violence, mafia tradition, and a vision that would reshape the underworld forever. This ain't just a story about gangsters. It's a story about poverty, immigration, fear, corruption, survival, and power. Because the American Mafia didn't appear overnight, it was built, one extortion, one counterfeit bill, one barrel murder at a time. And at the center of it all stood the Morello family. The barrel murder. April 1903, East Village, New York. A woman on her way to work at 5:30 in the morning sees a barrel on the road. However, what's interesting is the two legs protruding from the barrel. The horrified woman calls the police. The police arrive at the scene and find a male corpse inside the barrel, his throat almost cut to the root. The victim is Benedetto Madonia, who arrived in New York just over a week earlier. Through their investigation, the police and the American Secret Service learned that the victim was taken from the tavern where he was last seen, with a burly man and a dark figure accompanying him. The murder is the work of the Morello family, the first Mafia family in America. The order was given by the leader of the family and the first boss of bosses in America, Giuseppe Morello. Giuseppe Morello, who used murder as the sole means of discipline within his organization, would become a pioneer of a tradition in America. Here you have the Morello family, the first Mafia family in the American underworld. Sicily, the birthplace of Malavita. Life in 1860, Sicily varied greatly depending on the region. The fertile lands and landowners in the east of Sicily provided a relatively decent living for the people. Western Sicily, on the other hand, was a region of poverty, with its mountains, barren lands, and poor population. Only the coasts and Palermo thrived with industries like fishing, while the owners of the land, orange groves and lemon groves, lived comfortably in Palermo. Their overseers, called gabellotti, controlled the land and added to their profits. However, factors such as dense population, earthquakes, and famine devastated the poor. During the 1908 Messina earthquake, thousands died in Sicily. Those escaping poverty in western Sicily began migrating to Italian cities and eventually to America. For those left behind, life meant malavita, or a bad life. Gangs, brotherhoods, and underground communities were the only chance for Sicilian youth. The strong ones belonged to a cosca, a group. But even gang life was not enough for those in the interior. In Corleone, a small town surrounded by mountains in western Sicily, Giuseppe Morello was condemned to live the worst of lives. Actually, the Morello family had been a prominent family in Corleone for generations. When Giuseppe's father, Calogero, was 26, he married the 16-year-old Angela. Giuseppe, the eldest son of the couple, was born on May 2, 1867, in Corleone. However, when Calogero died at the age of 32, young Angela had to marry again to take care of her son and daughter. The young widow Angela married a Corleone man named Bernardo Terranova. Giuseppe's stepfather, Bernardo Terranova, was a member of one of Sicily's dark groups. Giuseppe, who would become a Mafia member through this connection, became one of the men of the Mafia boss Salvatore Cutrera at the age of 22. Morello had a congenital defect in his right hand. Only his ring finger was normal. The other fingers were twisted and unusable. Therefore, in his life, he would try to compensate for the lack of his hand with determination, ruthlessness, and authority. A young Morello was a good organizer, and he stood out from most of the young people in his region by being literate. He stole cattle from shepherds for the Mafia, but this would change. Giovanni Vella, an incorruptible lawman unlike most Sicilian police officers, pursued cattle thieves and initiated a serious investigation. Vella went even further and suppressed police officers working for the Mafia. Just when the Corleone Mafia asked Morello to do a favor for the family, Vella was ambushed by Morello and another Mafia member in front of his house. Shot in the lung, Vella would lose his life. When asked who did it while gasping for breath, he could only utter the word cattle, which meant cattle thieves. That is, men like Morello. Morello was immediately arrested, but he was released on bail. 2 civilian witnesses who testified about the murder would be killed during this process, one of them being a woman. His silence during interrogation placed Morello in a reliable position in the Mafia world. Along with this position, Morello would shift to a new area in Corleone, counterfeiting. In those years, counterfeiting, producing, and using counterfeit money was not a federal crime in Italy. In addition, the abilities of police officers in remote places like Corleone were not suitable for solving sophisticated crimes such as counterfeiting. There was already a functioning counterfeiting network in the big city of Palermo, and now, through Morello, this network had spread to Corleone. However, over time, the police began to dismantle the network in Palermo, and eventually Morello became one of the wanted ones. About to be arrested, the Morellos made a decision that would change their lives: to immigrate to America. Arrival in America. In 1892, the Morello and Terranova families immigrated to New York. Father Bernardo, his wife Angela, and their 6 children were on the ship. These children were Morello's maternal siblings. In addition to 3 sisters, 7-year-old Vincenzo, 5-year-old Ciro, and 3-year-old Niccolo were on the same ship. Meanwhile, Morello's wife, Maria, whom he married in Sicily, was also on the ship. In Maria's arms, their 2-month-old son, Calogero, was also accompanying them. In the late 19th century, the largest immigrant groups in New York were still the Irish and Germans. A small number of Chinese, along with Spanish and Greek immigrants, had now taken their places in immigrant neighborhoods. In the early 20th century, there would be an explosion in the number of Italian immigrants, reaching 150,000 in New York. In fact, the first Italians to come to New York were the skilled workers, masters, and craftsmen of northern Italy. Northern Italy was an industrialized and developed region. Therefore, those who came from there were qualified immigrants. However, things changed in the 1880s. Immigrants from the regions of Naples and Sicily, where a different breed of Italians were born, were qualified to work simple jobs due to the poverty and lack of opportunity in their regions. With their dark skin, lack of knowledge of English, eating habits, blood feuds, and knife fights, Southern Italians were extreme for American society. Most of them intended to save money quickly and return to their homeland. They had no intention of being permanent in America. Therefore, most immigrants were young men. Also, since there was no intelligence cooperation between Sicily and America, most gangsters with criminal records in Sicily could easily come to America, since their records in Sicily usually were not a problem. Manhattan's Little Italy became a large Italian ghetto, hosting many Italians. In a 1-room apartment, sometimes 10 to 15 people had to live among cockroaches, bedbugs, and rats amid garbage-filled streets. However, even the minimum wage they earned in New York was 30 times higher than in Sicily. Sicilian workers would find an English-speaking padrone, go to the jobs he found, and save money. The padrone or padroni would pocket their commissions. Meanwhile, there was a migration, especially in East Harlem, formed by the Corleonesi, or people from Corleone. But when the Morello Terranova family started working, the crisis of 1893 broke out. This event, called the Panic of 1893, was like a rehearsal for the Great Depression, and the economy collapsed significantly. While at least 5 major American banks went bankrupt, the value of many stocks plummeted. It was challenging for Terranova and Morello to support their family of 2 women and 7 children. Additionally, the only one in the family who spoke English was Terranova's daughter, Lucia. The others did not know English. Another region where Italian immigrants settled was Louisiana. New Orleans, a port city, hosted many Italians. Since it was also an agricultural area, the family migrated to Louisiana in 1894. They worked as laborers in the fields. Of course, manual labor was quite challenging for Giuseppe, whose one hand was almost entirely dysfunctional. While they worked in the fields, the children were busy cutting and collecting weeds. A year later, the Terranova Morello family moved to Dallas, Texas. Here they worked in the cotton fields of Texas. After 2 years of working there, the Terranova Morello family couldn't find what they were looking for economically. Almost everyone in the family contracted malaria. According to rumors, they also had problems with other Sicilians living nearby in the region. In the early months of 1897, the Terranova Morello family returned to Manhattan. This return would be a definitive one. During this period, New York's Italian population had tripled. By the year 1900, their numbers would reach 200,000. They formed new Italian ghettos in areas like Little Italy, East Harlem, and Greenwich Village, areas that our followers know would later become power centers of the Genovese family. The economy was improving. Along with Italians, trade in products such as lemons, olive oil, artichokes, and wine began. Italian grocers, shoemakers, bankers, and other entrepreneurs were now everywhere. However, Little Italy was still a troublesome place, with knife fights, white slavery, theft, and extortion. Therefore, business owners needed security, or rather, protection from those who threatened them. In addition, wealthier immigrants were becoming the new residents of the neighborhood, and they would become the targets of the Black Hand, also known as Italian kidnappers. According to police reports during those years, only 1 out of 250 crimes committed in Italian neighborhoods was reported to the police. The Southern Italian omertà culture made dialogue with the police impossible for the community. Wealthy Italians were exposed to threatening letters from the Black Hand and gangs. With these letters, the gangsters demanded ransom before even kidnapping anyone, sometimes intimidating them and asking for money without much trouble. Icons like bloody knives, revolvers, black hands, and pierced hearts were also included in the letters. The concept of the Black Hand was created by journalists as a result of these Black Hand drawings. But the Black Handers were just the beginning. The American Mafia would take on a whole new form with the Morello family. Still, Morello and the Terranovas had not yet committed crimes in America. In New York, the family used their money to pay the rent for the places they stayed and for Bernardo's ornamental plastering business. During this time, Ciro, Vincenzo, and Niccolo also helped their father in the business. In his spare time, Giuseppe Morello, who would later be known as Clutch Hand, helped his stepfather Bernardo while making his own investments. Morello first bought a coal depot, but things didn't go well. Later, he opened 1, then 2 bars in Little Italy. These also operated at a loss and were sold. His last investment was a date factory. This, too, would be sold at a loss within months. Counterfeit kings. In 1899, the bankrupt Morello turned to a business area he knew well from Sicily counterfeiting. Morello, who couldn't make ends meet above ground, would go underground once again. Besides the thugs he did counterfeiting with, those who did it in Corleone had spread to different American cities, such as Kansas City, New Orleans, Buffalo, and even Seattle. There were hundreds of Sicilian thugs who were counterfeiting just in New York. Thus, Morello set up a small printing press in his house on 106th Street. Although it was a small, somewhat shabby machine, it was sufficient for Morello to start. Here, he printed money and, through connections, cashed it quickly in places where money flowed fast: bars, gambling dens, and restaurants. This house would be Morello's first headquarters. In Morello's first gang, the task of distributing the money belonged to the young Sicilian Calogero Maiori. Maiori would give money to a few Sicilians and mostly Irish thugs, and they would cash counterfeit bills in places around the city. About 8 to 10 thugs bought counterfeit bills from Morello at a 60% discount. The rest was up to them. These men were called queer pushers, who circulated the fake money. It was during this process that Morello would show his dark side. The Irish girl, Mary Callahan, who was the girlfriend of one of his men, was responsible for cleaning the house where counterfeit money was printed, as well as cooking. The young girl, who had no idea about counterfeiting, entered a room she shouldn't have one day, saw the printing press, and vanished without a trace. Morello had taken an extremely ruthless measure to prevent his secret from being revealed. The police conducting the investigation could not find a printing press or a body in this house on 106th Street. Morello, who went underground for a few months, was back in business by March. The American Secret Service and police began to trace a spread of counterfeit money in New York. Morello's Irishmen started talking. Finally, the police managed to trace the organization to the young Calogero Maiori. Maiori was caught with counterfeit money in his pocket, but he kept his mouth shut. Still, in the end, it led to Morello's arrest. Morello, arrested for the first time in U.S. territory, had never been caught with any counterfeit money. So even though agents suspected he was the ringleader, there was no clear evidence. Irishman Gleason, whose girlfriend was killed, identified him as the gang leader, but the evidence was insufficient. The arrest was a big lesson for Morello. Understanding that he couldn't trust anyone he didn't know and hire without references, the Corleones would now establish a new organization from top to bottom. In this organization, only compatriots, and if possible, only Corleonesi, would be included. Although Charles Matranga established the first Mafia organization in New Orleans in the late 1800s, this family did not last. However, the family Morello would establish might last over a century. Morello chose relatives and people he knew from Sicily and Corleone for the top ranks of his family. Those at the lower ranks, although not Corleonesi, would at least be selected from Western Sicilians, that is, people from the same culture and region. Anyone becoming a member of the Morello family had to have a reference from Sicily. Until 1903, the family established with this principle, with the participation of lower-ranking Western Sicilian members, had reached about 30 members. During this period, Morello's main muscle was Vito Loduca, a former member of the Italian Navy. Loduca, who escaped from a 7-year prison sentence in Sicily, was older than most members of the gang. With his cruelty and strength, Loduca earned Morello's admiration. Loduca was also crucial in counterfeiting. Constantly traveling between New York and Pittsburgh, he delivered Morello's counterfeit money to Sicilians in Pennsylvania. The ruthless Loduca once kidnapped the 8-year-old son of a wealthy Italian and took a ransom of $155,000. Giuseppe Lamanna and the Lobo brothers also became early lieutenants of the Morello family. When these men came to Morello, they gave reference letters from respectable people in Sicily to Morello. Only this way did Clutch Hand Morello accept them into his family. Sicilian gangsters indeed sought references from notorious individuals in their villages in Sicily through mail, telegrams, and letters. Sometimes these letters were even transported among American cities, covering hundreds of miles. Among Sicilian immigrants, one individual especially had the respect of everyone, including Morello, Vito Cascioferro, a mafia boss from the heart of Sicily. A reference letter in the name of Don Vito carried serious weight. Don Vito Ferro conducted counterfeiting activities in New York and contributed to Morello's operations. However, a different man from all these would enter Morello's life, becoming a key figure for the Morello family, at least as crucial as him. Lupo the Wolf. Born in Palermo, Ignazio Lupo, later known as Lupo the Wolf, was 10 years younger than Morello and had less experience. But he possessed vision, intelligence, creativity, and sophistication in criminal activities that Morello lacked. Not only with his intelligence, but also with his attire, style, and charisma, Lupo stood out from others. Reportedly, alongside his tough appearance, Lupo had an extremely gentle, even effeminate voice and teary eyes, presenting an emotional profile. Yet Lupo had an unpredictable, ruthless side and the potential for violence. His last name literally meant wolf in Italian. When Lupo was in Sicily at the age of 18, his father opened a clothing store for him. Rumor has it that during these years, Lupo was also a member of a gang involved in extortion-style crimes in the region. In 1898, due to an incident, Lupo had to leave Sicily after killing a man who pulled a knife on him. Lupo lowered his prices to beat competitors, starting from Liverpool in the United Kingdom, then to Montreal, Canada, and finally reaching Buffalo, New York. Lupo had received a 21-year prison sentence in absentia for murder in Italy. Wealthy from his family, Lupo sold products imported from Sicily, such as olive oil, cheese, and wine. In 1901, he opened a large market in the heart of Manhattan's Little Italy. He even entered the wholesale business. The quality of Lupo's products even became a topic in New York Times columns at the time. However, behind this clean businessman facade, Lupo hid darker truths. Lupo had allied himself with the Morello family in expanding his business. In return, he provided the family with a new operational center in his markets. Rich Italians who could be extorted by the Morello gang were identified and marked as potential targets. The two men complemented each other. Palermo-born Lupo was a figure with business acumen, well-dressed and influencing those around him. Morello from Corleone lived in shadows, a powerful force that Sicilians feared and obeyed. Lupo would especially help Morello manage his money and utilize illegal profits. The alliance between the two became a kinship, and Lupo married Salvatrice Terranova, one of the Terranova brothers' sisters. The couple would later have 5 children. Morello was an unfortunate man in family life. His first wife, Maria, died in 1898 from malaria she contracted in Texas. His mother, Angela, found a bride for Morello through arranged marriage, and Morello married Lena from Sicily. Lena came to America with a dowry of $400. Lena's Salemi family had connections to the underworld, and this marriage would lead to a new alliance between the Salemi family and the Morello Terranova family. Morello and Lena had 3 daughters and a son. Lena was an educated, intelligent, and somewhat temperamental woman. Morello moved to a large house on 107th Street to make her happy, and Lena helped Morello get his life in order. During this time, Lupo's business prospered. His markets were now a chain all over Italian Harlem, extending into Brooklyn. As his chain grew, the business of identifying wealthy customers and threatening them with black hand letters for extortion also expanded. Lupo, involved in wholesaling, had to acquire many market owners' goods at exorbitant prices through threats. Threats included killing horses, crucial for transporting goods at the time, bombing stores, and even attacking homes. Many businesses went bankrupt because of Morello and Lupo. They even killed a butcher in Brooklyn because he refused to pay. The two Sicilians continued to ruin the lives of their hard-working fellow countrymen, feeding off them like parasites. This was the modus operandi of the Mafia in America, as it was everywhere else. Meanwhile, Morello continued counterfeiting but faced increased pressure from the Secret Service. Morello thought that sending counterfeit money to Italy and bringing it back from there would be the best way to avoid detection. Lupo was already importing goods from Italy. Money sent from New York to Italy on ships, along with barrels of olive oil and similar products ordered by Lupo, was brought back to America. Moreover, money transported by ships could be easily distributed to various cities like Pittsburgh and New Orleans. Morello and Lupo were not directly involved in the operation, avoiding police scrutiny. In the following years, those caught from Morello's organization, adhering to the omertà culture, didn't cooperate with the police and easily served 3 to 5 year prison sentences. Blood in the barrel. During this time, the barrel murder mentioned at the beginning occurred. Benedetto Madonia was tasked with paying the bribes necessary for the release of 2 of Morello's men arrested in Pittsburgh. When Madonia didn't receive enough money from Morello, he sent a letter expressing his anger, accusing Morello of not caring enough for his men. Madonia's brother-in-law was also in custody. Madonia sent $2,000 to New York for his trial. When Morello, feeling entitled as the boss, seized this money, Madonia wanted to meet him face to face. In the first week of Madonia's arrival in New York, he was detained in a tavern-type place where he had dinner. Tommaso Petto, aka the Ox, a muscular enforcer for the Morello gang, and reportedly Morello himself, came to the tavern, took Madonia, and left. Madonia did not object to being detained, and the Italians in the tavern were completely indifferent to the incident. Everyone knew who Morello was, and Madonia was a marked man. It was a situation reminiscent of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Chronicle of a Death Foretold. Outside, holding Madonia, 2 men restrained him while a third, with a switchblade, swiftly cut his throat. Madonia's brutally executed body would be found inside a barrel, dismembered as mentioned at the beginning. The body was intentionally left on the street to be found. The newspapers called it the barrel murder, and it created a significant sensation in the media. The Secret Service and police investigating the case learned of Madonia's connection to the Morello family. They promptly arrested 13 members of the family, including Giuseppe Morello and Lupo the Wolf. Many Sicilians attended the trial and insulted the judge. Some even made gestures implying the judge would die. Morello hired an expensive lawyer, but the Secret Service had obtained correspondence indicating Morello knew Madonia, despite Morello claiming not to know him. The evidence contradicted him. Madonia's son also testified in court. Another clear piece of evidence was a valuable pocket watch found on the Ox, Tommaso Petto, that Madonia's wife said her husband had an identical watch. Petto became the main suspect in the murder. The barrel murder process led Morello to take new precautions. Morello, a cold-blooded calculating leader, did not hesitate to kill his own men. This time, to maintain internal discipline within the organization, he returned to murder again. Concerned that someone inside might be informing the Secret Service, Morello believed that internal betrayal led to the information about Madonia. Therefore, in the fall of 1903, the Morello family would witness a bloody purge. The first to die was Sicilian Salvatore Esposito, suspected of squealing to the Secret Service. Although Esposito was not a traitor in reality, he realized he would be killed and bought a ticket to Naples, intending to escape the execution. However, he could not escape. The ox, Tommaso Petto, paid the price for his carelessness with death. Perhaps being released as the main suspect in the murder, which was a legal fiasco, drew Morello's attention. On the evening of October 21st, returning home from work, Petto was executed with 5 long-barreled rifle bullets. The massive thug's chest had 5 massive holes. The next name on the hit list was Vito Lo Duca, an early lieutenant of the Morello family. While in Sicily during this time, Lo Duca was shot and killed. Another gangster associated with Morello was also executed following him. A butcher named Giovanni Zaccone, another Sicilian, was killed. Reportedly, Zaccone was the one who cut Madonia's body and stuffed it into a barrel. 7 hitmen had turned Zaccone into a sieve with pump-action shotguns. With all these executions, all witnesses of the barrel murder were eliminated. Afterward, the investigation was halted and the case was shelved. However, Morello would now be closely monitored due to this incident. He began walking fast, hiding, and taking different routes to his destinations. Morello also had his letters sent not to his own home, but to other people's homes to avoid Secret Service surveillance. The rise of the Black Hand. Between 1903 and 1907, crimes related to the Black Hand in New York, including bombings and stabbings, increased fourfold. In response to this increase, the police force employed more Italian police officers. Joseph Petrosino, one such officer, was extremely determined in fighting the Mafia. Petrosino even formed an Italian unit within the police force. He had successfully captured and imprisoned some significant Camorra bosses from Naples who were responsible for murders. After a point, Petrosino began closely monitoring Lupo's wholesaler operations and followed Morello every moment, even during travels outside New York. Back in 1903, Morello's influence did not extend beyond Little Italy. But now he had a broad sphere of influence reaching not only the city, but also all Italian neighborhoods in the United States. Of course, there were other Italian groups as well. Another Manhattan group was the 5 Points Gang, led by Paolo Vaccarelli, also known as Paul Kelly. The gang would produce Lucky Luciano, Al Capone, and many other crime figures. However, the 5 Points Gang was not as organized as Morello's for the time being. Therefore, they were not as influential as the Morellos. Many names from the 5 Points Gang entered the Morello family. Even their leader, Kelly, was rumored to be under Morello's protection. The Morello family, with the definitive leadership of Giuseppe Morello and the vice presidency of Lupo the Wolf, was a strong, compact, and organized group. With the addition of the Terranova brothers, Vincenzo, Niccolo, and Ciro, the family had grown. The Terranovas committed many murders for the organization. Orders always came from the top, from Morello. Morello was even supplying weapons to the men in his family and providing them with shooting training. According to rumors, in the early days, family members were receiving a modest amount of weekly earnings from the leadership. The Morello family was built upon 9 principles. Insulting another family member and leaving New York without Morello's knowledge resulted in a fine. Lying and pulling a weapon on another family member were grounds for expulsion. Family members had to pay 4/5 of their earnings to Morello. Family meetings ordered by the boss at least one day in advance were mandatory to attend. According to later confessions by Nicola Gentile, Morello had become the most respected boss of the Italian Mafia in America. Morello was now boss of bosses, or capo di tutti capi. According to Gentile's statements, similar families were gradually emerging in New York, New Orleans, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Kansas City, San Francisco, Cleveland, St. Louis, Los Angeles, and Buffalo. Morello would send letters to these cities to advise and direct them on issues such as disputes between the other families, general rules, and collaborations. He made occasional visits to New Orleans. In fact, the structure later known as the Mafia Commission existed in those years. However, it was a simpler structure compared to its final form. Although Morello was the boss of bosses, he mostly refrained from intervening in other families. He generally had influence in the form of advice and requests. In this early stage of the Mafia, there was said to be a council formed by the fathers of a few families, and a council consisting of 150 Mafia members. During these years, council members were generally Mafia bosses who were often illiterate. Nevertheless, the council prevented major Mafia wars and resolved issues at the table. During this time, the Morello family continued to extort the growing Italian population, collecting protection money, and even engaging in kidnapping crimes similar to the Black Hand. Counterfeiting operations were ongoing. In addition, insurance fraud was among the Morello operations. The master of this business was Antonio Cicala, a relative of Lupo and a member of the family. In their operations, the Morello family forced business owners to obtain expensive fire insurance. Later, the shops that took the insurance were set on fire by Cicala, and most of the insurance money went into the Morello family's pockets. Cicala would later claim to have used glycerin for the operation, allowing arson without leaving traces. Throughout all this, Morello kept police officers, detectives, and many other authorities in line with bribes. Meanwhile, the Terranova brothers were also expanding their operations. Vincenzo entered the icebox business, a popular business before refrigeration. Cairo would enter the fruit and vegetable sector, eventually becoming known as the Artichoke King. Only Niccolo did not have his own business. However, as a natural leader, Niccolo played a key role in running the family operation. His support in taking care of financial matters for his stepbrother Morello was significant. Meanwhile, Morello also expanded his investments, buying a spaghetti restaurant, a barber shop, and 2 houses to rent. With the advice of Lupo the Wolf, the two entered construction, building places in Manhattan to be rented to immigrants. Later, they transformed this construction business into a cooperative. Not surprisingly, Morello took charge of the cooperative treasury. The main goal of the cooperative was to build 2 large buildings. The buildings were completed in 1906, but those who invested in the cooperative did not get a return on their investments. Morello and Lupo continued to build larger buildings by taking out mortgages. This time, most of the cooperative funds were bought by Mafia members. They even had investors from outside New York, as far as Mississippi. During this period, the net value of Lupo's home was over $110,000, which is equivalent to about $4 million today. Lupo and Morello had bought the lands at exorbitant prices, expecting more immigrants to come to New York. They bought the land even at a loss. However, in 1907, another major crisis hit, causing the construction business to collapse and go bankrupt. Not only that, but 5 banks had failed, and Little Italy, along with hundreds of small businesses, went bankrupt. By 1908, the cooperative formed by Lupo and Morello had been depleted. The problem was that the people who received the funds were gangsters. Therefore, Morello couldn't just claim bankruptcy and escape from the situation. No matter that he was the boss of bosses, other bosses began to demand answers from him. When the money dried up, the team returned to old crimes. Lupo focused again on threats and extortion. This time, Italian police chief Joseph Petrosino, unable to bear the threats against his fellow countrymen, visited Lupo at his place and warned him. According to rumors, they even argued, and Petrosino knocked Lupo down with a single blow. He then gave him a solid beating on the ground. Lupo eventually tried to escape his creditors by hiding and ordering $50,000 worth of goods for his grocery store on credit. He wanted to take these goods to New Jersey ports and sell them there in secret, but Petrosino was after him and his goods. To make matters worse, his creditors were now threatening Morello with death. Taking these threats seriously, Morello turned to what he knew best: counterfeiting. And the decision to counterfeit money would take Morello to an unexpected point: the secret printing house. It all began with the arrival of Antonio Comito, a cultured, law-abiding Calabrian, to New York. Speaking 4 languages, including Spanish, Comito had spent 7 years in Latin America. He came from the poor Calabria region, similar to Naples and Sicily. Comito had worked as a teacher and even worked alongside the Italian consul in Brazil. However, what made him invaluable to the Morello family was his experience in printing. Becoming unemployed again in Latin America, Comito migrated to New York. Here, he stayed with his brother and met Caterina, an Italian woman in her 30s, whom he married. He joined a society called Sons of Italy, an association for Italian immigrants. It was here that people in the association eventually introduced him to another printer. This printer's name was Antonio Cecala, the gangster who burned shops for Morello. However, Comito did not yet know about him or Morello. He was unaware of who they were, the Mafia or counterfeiting. With the promise of a job, he and his wife would eventually find themselves in a vehicle traveling to the outskirts of New York. Cecala and another gangster named Salvatore Sina took them to a remote place and said, "This is where you will live." Comito and his wife realized they couldn't escape. In this remote place, they had to cook, clean, and most importantly, produce counterfeit money. When Comito initially claimed to Cecala that he didn't know how to print money, Cecala said to him, "If you don't print, you will die." Cecala also mentioned that this was a 20-person operation, and Cecala promised him that Comito and his wife would be respected as Mafia members and would become millionaires at the end of the process. But he also added that Comito would serve the Mafia for the rest of his life. Another gangster, Zio Vincenzo, also known as Uncle Vincenzo, a big, muscular Sicilian, came to the printing house where the group was located. Thus, the population of the house increased to 6. One day, Vincenzo told a story that summarized how terrifying the men around Comito and his wife were in this house. When Vincenzo was a shepherd in Sicily, 2 men wanted to buy an ox from him. When Vincenzo mentioned the price, one of the men took out money and showed it to him. At this moment, Vincenzo took his rifle without saying a word, killed both men on the spot, and took their money. Comito found himself in a difficult situation with his wife among such frightening men. He was aware that any mistake would result in an unquestioned killing of himself and his wife. Comito and another master printer printed money, and it was carried by Cecala and others and introduced into the market. These men carried counterfeit money to cities like Chicago, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and beyond. Counterfeit bills were everywhere. However, Italian Police Chief Joseph Petrosino was after Morello's organization. Petrosino knew that by proving their crimes, he could guarantee their deportation to Italy. According to him, there were approximately 5,000 criminal individuals roaming the streets of New York alone. Knowing this, Petrosino made a crazy plan to go to Sicily, get their criminal records, and ensure their deportation to Italy. The brave-hearted Petrosino secretly descended to Rome. He registered at a hotel in his name in Palermo. He wanted to quickly finish his work and leave Sicily as soon as possible. However, Petrosino's arrival in Italy was mentioned in a newspaper article, and the Neapolitan Mafia and Cassio Ferro soon learned of his presence. They assigned the job to two Sicilians. On the night of March 12, 1909, while Petrosino was waiting for an informant to give him information, the two Sicilians shot him in the face. Petrosino was quick enough to return fire, but he died without hitting the target. Lupo and Morello were relieved for the time being. They could never have committed such a murder in America, but the crime had happened far away from them in Sicily. Lupo came to a secret printing house where Comito stayed to celebrate this murder with Uncle Vincenzo. The gang was printing 500 counterfeit bills a day. In a short time, they were producing $20,400 worth of money. Morello's goal was to print a total of $5 million and stop the operation. The $5 million in 1909 equated to well over $70 million in 2026. However, Comito could not see the promised money. During this time, he would only receive a few cents for all the suffering he endured. He earned so little that he couldn't even buy a pair of shoes for his wife, Caterina. And when the counterfeit Canadian dollars he printed turned out to be poor quality, the gang members even threatened him by putting a knife to his throat, saying they would cut him up and feed him to his wife. But the poor quality was not Comito's fault. The printing machines in the workshop were cheap and small. Morello knew this and ensured that nothing happened to Comito. In the end, the team produced $100,000 and decided to stop production. Comito could only receive $40 from the promised $500. Today, this amount is equivalent to about $1,300. The good news, however, was that Comito and his wife were now free. Immediately returning to New York, Comito found a job in a real printing house. Of course, this was only until Morello's second order. Upon Morello's order, Comito might have to serve the Mafia again. However, counterfeit money was gradually coming to light. Banks from all over the country were sending bundles of fake money to the Secret Service. Several distributors were caught, and one of them, a Sicilian named Sam Lima, was caught red-handed. Lima, a distrustful man scared of prison, decided to become a witness in exchange for not appearing in court and keeping his name out of the media. The Secret Service, which gave marked bills to Lima, circulated them, eventually tracing the trail to Lupo's wholesaler. It was revealed that Antonio Secala was also part of the scheme. Morello's counterfeiting pyramid had been exposed. Secala's farm in the rural area of New York was also put under surveillance. Soon, the police arrested Morello, Lupo, and all the leading counterfeiters of the family. The fall of Morello. In December 1909, the Secret Service learned about Comito's role in the printing operation. Although a search of Comito's house yielded no evidence of a crime, under pressure and already victimized by the Morello family, Comito decided to become a witness. Comito's detailed statements, spanning over 100 pages, bore fruit. Giuseppe Morello received a sentence of 25 years in prison and hard labor, while Lupo received a 30-year prison sentence. During those times, prisoners were required to work in tasks like stone breaking. In court, their shock was evident. Morello fainted upon hearing his sentence translated into Italian. Emotional Lupo had tears in his eyes. Both men found it difficult to believe the sentences they received. Secala, Sina, and the others received 15-year sentences. These were the heaviest sentences ever given for counterfeiting in America up to that date. Meanwhile, a reward of $2,500 was placed on Comito's head by the Mafia. Morello, incapacitated with only one hand in prison, was assigned to the tailor workshop instead of stone breaking. The earliest possible release date for Morello was a full 17 years later, in 1926, under parole. For Lupo, it was in 1930. The Terranova brothers tried every means, including political pressure, to release their brother and Lupo from prison. They even considered breaking them out of prison. However, all efforts were in vain. Morello and Lupo, the ultimate godfathers of the family, had been sentenced to long years in prison without return. Meanwhile, Antonio Comito first went to Mexico and then returned to South America. Despite causing significant damage to the Mafia, he continued to live without a scratch. The Secret Service had kept its promise to him. Despite their loyalty oaths, the Terranova brothers could not adequately support Morellos and Lupo's wives. Both women had to work and take care of their children. Morello and Lupo, depressed in prison, were pushed to the brink of suicide by the loss of power and money. According to rumors, Morello even considered reaching an agreement with the government in exchange for revealing the killers of Police Chief Petrosino. Hearing this, Lupo also contemplated doing the same. However, when the Mafia threatened their families outside, both abandoned the idea. Within a few months, revenge killings began. Lima, who had betrayed the Morellos, survived an attempted murder. Another grocer believed to have betrayed the Morellos, and another Mafia member were killed during the process. However, the family was in a bad situation with no chance of appeal. In 1911, 65 out of 110 members of the family on the streets became targets of other gangs. The war in Harlem. For unknown reasons, Morello chose the Lamont brothers to manage the family during this time. Powerful figures like Eugene Ubriaco and Joe DeMarco joined the family, but Harlem was no longer exclusively Morello's territory. First, a Neapolitan loan shark, a woman named Pasquarella Spinelli, established her own organization. The organization committed various crimes such as threats, extortion, and theft. It is believed that Spinelli amassed a fortune of nearly $10 million in today's currency through these activities. The Lamonts immediately formed an alliance with her. The stables owned by Spinelli were named Murder Stables, where the enemies of the Morello family would be buried. However, Donna Spinelli was assassinated shortly after forming this alliance. The circle was closing in on the Morellos. A few weeks later, the Morellos suffered another major blow. Don Giuseppe Morello's 20-year-old son, Calogero, was shot and killed in the street. The attackers were members of the Baker Gang in Manhattan's Upper East Side. The exact reason for the murder is unknown, but it is believed to have occurred as a result of an argument. However, according to another rumor, this was an act of revenge taken by the Madonia family. The Terranova brothers wanted revenge. However, the Lamont brothers, who took over the leadership, did not care about avenging Calogero. Niccolo Terranova, also known as Nick, took an oath of revenge at Calogero's funeral and insulted the Lamonts. In the following weeks, members of the Baker Gang were killed one by one. In 1912, 22-year-old Nick Terranova emerged as a prominent figure within the family. Eventually, the Lamontis stepped back, and the leadership was handed over to Nick Terranova. However, behind the scenes, the Lamonts found a new and much more powerful ally, Giosuè Gallucci, known as the King of Little Italy. Gallucci, a large, well-dressed, wealthy man, controlled the street lotteries in Harlem and was involved in many crimes such as extortion. Additionally, Gallucci held political power by controlling the votes of Italian voters and had close ties with the Democratic Party center, Tammany Hall. But the Terranovas were not pleased with this alliance. In May 1914, Fortunato, the elder of the Lamont brothers, was killed with 3 bullets in broad daylight. Giuseppe Gallucci had survived perhaps 10 assassination attempts throughout his career. In the same year, one of his bodyguards was killed. Being a bodyguard for Gallucci was a lethal profession. Finally, on May 17th, Gallucci was executed by gunfire in a cafe he owned with his son Luca. According to some sources, the Brooklyn Camorra had a hand in this murder. So with this killing, the Morello family had once again seized power in Little Italy. Nick Terranova took over the coal and olive oil trade left by Gallucci. The Brooklyn Camorra temporarily began managing the Harlem numbers game. However, with migration, rivals were increasing. Jews who had now migrated to the Lower East Side were forming their own gangs. On the West Side, the Irish established strong gangs in Hell's Kitchen. By the year 1912, there were 4 major Mafia families in New York, including the Morello family. The first of these would later be known as the Bonanno family. The leader of this family, founded in Brooklyn, was Nicola Schirò from Castellammare del Golfo, Sicily. Also known as Cola, Schirò was more of a businessman than a leader. However, his fellow countrymen soon joined him, and they became a new force in Brooklyn. The second family, which would become the Gambino family, was founded by Manfredi Mineo from Palermo. Mineo, an effective leader, preferred to stay behind the scenes as a boss. The third family was the family of Salvatore D'Aquila, extending from Brooklyn to Manhattan. In fact, Manfredi Mineo would later join this family, becoming one of D'Aquila's men, and thus the D'Aquila family would be one of the groups forming the Gambino family. D'Aquila was an extremely tough, aggressive boss. Having to share Harlem with him, the Morellos now faced an extremely formidable rival. Although the Mafia is a world of hierarchies, charisma was an essential factor. After Morello's arrest, the family had suffered a significant loss in charismatic leadership. Despite Nick Terranova's efforts to recover, Salvatore D'Aquila would become the new charismatic leader for the Sicilians in New York. D'Aquila added many Sicilians who had fled from the Morellos and had not found what they wanted with him to his family. Even former veterans of the Morello family, such as the hitman Giuseppe Fontana, who had killed the manager of the Sicilian Bank in 1893, were now joining his ranks. Soon, D'Aquila declared himself the boss of bosses, capo di tutti capi. He now controlled external policies and recruitment processes for all 4 families. The others soon began to fear him. The membership of D'Aquila's family was equal to the total of the other 3. However, the Morellos did not give up quickly. First, they executed the hitman Fontana, who had just joined D'Aquila. Their next targets would be Joe DeMarco and his gang, who had stopped paying them. But an entirely new enemy, the Camorra from Naples, was waiting in the wings in Brooklyn, affecting everyone. Therefore, the New York Mafia-Camorra War had erupted. In summary, Nick Terranova was lured to Brooklyn with the promise of a meeting with Brooklyn Camorristas and was killed. But after some killings, the Camorra leadership, as a result of the confessions of an informer, was sent to prison for Terranova's murder. The Camorra rose rapidly and fell quickly, permanently erased from the American underworld. This was also due to Neapolitans being outnumbered by Sicilians. With the death of Nick Terranova, the leadership of the Morello family temporarily passed into the hands of the remaining Terranova brothers, Chiaro and Vincenzo. The return on the old fox. By the year 1920, Giuseppe Morello had been released on parole after serving 10 years in prison. However, New York, as well as the world, had changed. The boss of bosses, Salvatore D'Aquila, feared the presence of the old fox Morello. He did not want to see Lupo, who would soon be released, as a boss either. Initially, he wanted them killed, but with the intervention of friends like Gentile, he withdrew this order. In their place, the family would be led by Giuseppe Morello, who would later take on the nickname Joe the Boss. Short, stocky, ambitious, and always ready to fight, Morello had started his career with Black Hand-type crimes. He had served 4 years in prison for crimes like robbery and was released in 1917. How Morello rose so quickly is largely a mystery. But what is known is that this relatively poor man living above a bar in 1919 would become a millionaire shortly after the start of Prohibition. Controlling Little Italy, Morello, with his contacts, the advantage of his region, and the remaining power of the Morellos, quickly grew in the illegal alcohol market. He reached power closer to that of his rival, Salvatore D'Aquila. Moreover, he added young Italians and gangsters more adapted to American culture to his family. Among them were Joe Adonis, Frank Costello, and Salvatore Lucania, also known as Lucky Luciano. Supported by the Terranova brothers, Joe the Boss's consigliere, the advisor, was none other than Giuseppe Morello, who was considered the founder of the American Mafia. However, D'Aquila was uncomfortable with this new alliance. Having such an ambitious man as Morello, with the support and consultancy of Morello, was a significant threat to him. D'Aquila immediately took action. The Harlem Tiger, Vincenzo Terranova, was shot and killed in the market area on May 8, 1922, by his orders. He was 36 years old at the time. In August of the same year, Joe the Boss was targeted in an assassination attempt at his own place by 4 men, but survived. Seeking revenge, Morello had Alberto Wenti, D'Aquila's chief hitman, killed in a restaurant that same month. With D'Aquila starting to feel concerned, he eventually wanted to reconcile. Thus, the Mafia War of 1922 came to an end. Years later, on November 10, 1928, Salvatore D'Aquila would be killed while going to a doctor's appointment from his home. His family would come under the management of Manfredi Mineo. Thus, Joe the Boss became the boss of bosses without dispute. The New York Mafia experienced a short period of peace. Aging bosses like Cola Chiro and Manfredi Mineo had earned enough money and had become too old and comfortable for the violent nature of their positions. Meanwhile, there were now 5 families in New York. In addition to Chiro and Morello's family, which would later become the Genovese family and was the most powerful, the 4th family was the one led by Thomas Rena in the Bronx, which would become the future Lucchese family. Finally, the last family, newly founded by Sicilian Joe Profaci, later called the Colombo family, was established around 1928. The first target of Morello was Rena's family. When the income of Rena, who had an icebox business in the Bronx, attracted Morello's attention, Morello wanted to take over this business. When Rena, who objected, was killed in a hit, New York would once again be on the brink of a bloody war. Unlike Morello, his consigliere, Morello was an interventionist boss of bosses. Instead of being a silent power or soft power, he did not hesitate to intervene with other families, giving orders to their capos and meddling in their internal affairs. Eventually, his attitude brought his opponents together. With Rena's death, his family based in Brooklyn approached the family led by Cola Chiro. Chiro's family consisted of men from Castellammare del Golfo. The gangsters of this region, Castellamarese, had a unique pride compared to other gangsters. Being from the city meant more than being Sicilian to them. Therefore, they decided not to cave in for anyone. They were determined never to bow down to Masseria. This is why the Mafia War that would begin in 1930 would be called the Castellamarese War. The Castellamarese War begins. Giuseppe Morello, the old fox, made a few moves to protect Masseria. He had a Castellamarese ally in Detroit killed, and another boss killed Masseria's enemies by bribing Calabrians. He also had Vito Bonventre, perhaps the most powerful and richest man in his family, assassinated. Cola Chiro was now caught in the middle. He didn't want to fight the boss of bosses, Masseria, but he couldn't resist the desire of the gangsters in his family to fight Masseria. Seeing the approaching storm, the cautious, calm-natured boss, Cola Chiro, fled to Italy, and a boss who would become Masseria's arch-enemy took over the leadership of his family. Salvatore Maranzano from Castellammare del Golfo. At the age of 42, Salvatore Maranzano would become a major icon in the underworld. The war among them, that is, the Castellamarese War. When Maranzano became the boss, the Castellamarese War officially began. Maranzano, who also added young members like Joe Bonanno to his team, decided to eliminate the brain trust of Masseria. Maranzano aimed to get rid of the real mastermind behind Masseria, the old fox Morello. The old fox Morello who advised him behind the scenes, determining his tactics and strategies. At first, Maranzano seemed to be on the losing side and went to the mattresses with his gang. Many of his men were sleeping in bunk beds in secure hideouts, trying to avoid becoming Masseria's targets. However, during this time, a hitman joined Maranzano's ranks, known as the Buster from Chicago, an identity that remains uncertain even today. This unknown man in New York entered Morello's Italian Harlem office on August 15, 1930, at 3:45 p.m. with his accomplice. Maybe Maranzano's hiding encouraged Morello, or maybe he was relaxed because the war wasn't too official yet. It wasn't on the streets yet, so Morello was pushed into recklessness. Caught unprotected by hitmen, Morello, along with his two partners, became the target of bullets. Although Morello tried to move quickly and stop the attackers by running, during the attack the hitmen inside opened fire, unleashing a hail of bullets. At least a dozen shots were fired, and Giuseppe Morello fell to the ground, covered in blood from bullets to his cheek, chin, shoulder, and back. With fatal wounds to his lung and aorta, Clutch Hand Morello died half a minute after the attack. He was 63 years old when he died. Although his partner Lupo was released from prison in the 1930s, when it became clear that he continued organized crime, he went back inside. In his 60s, he returned to Brooklyn. In 1947, at the age of 69, he died of natural causes as an insignificant figure. Ciro, the last figure from the founders of the Morello family, fell out of favor during the Castellamarese War due to his apparent reluctance. Additionally, when the mayor of New York targeted his artichoke trade, financed with crime money, Cairo lost his fortune. Ciro Terranova suffered a stroke in 1938 due to grief, according to Valachi's confessions. 2 days later, at the age of 49, he passed away. When he died, he was a poor man. Ciro was the only brother among the Morello Terranova brothers who died not by a bullet, but of natural causes. The family they established, now under the leadership of Masseria, would engage in a bloody war against Maranzano. Later, this family would become the most powerful mafia family in New York, and even in America, the Genovese family. The moral: Giuseppe Morello didn't live to see the modern Mafia. He never saw Vegas, never saw the Commission in its final form, never saw the rise of men like Carlo Gambino, Vito Genovese, or John Gotti. But the blueprint, that was his. The hierarchy, the loyalty, the silence, the killings, the extortion, the structure, the fear. Before the Mafia became an American institution, it was a brutal immigrant survival machine built by men like Giuseppe Morello and Ignazio Lupo. They arrived in America with nothing, and by the time they were finished, they had built an empire in the shadows, one that would influence organized crime for over a century. And maybe that's the real story here. Not glamour, not movies, not cigars and expensive suits, but desperate men from broken places building power in a country that didn't know what was coming. Because long before the five families became legends, there was the Morello family, and the streets never forgot them. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the origins of the American Mafia, make sure you like, subscribe, and step into the Pizzaverse. We cover Mafia history, psychological breakdowns, internet culture, corruption, forgotten stories, and the dark corners of American history the mainstream usually cleans up for television. Because around here, we don't just tell stories, we dig up ghosts. Special thanks to everybody supporting the channel, the replay gang, the late night listeners, the history addicts, and everybody keeping these stories alive. Thank you for supporting independent storytelling and long-form documentaries. This has been another production from Pizzaverse Studios and Palermo Productions. Stay sharp. Stay skeptical. And remember, history usually hides the bodies before it writes the headlines. Giuseppe Morello, the original American Mafia architect. One bad hand, unlimited paranoia, and enough bodies to turn East Harlem into a cemetery with rent control. Before organized crime became classy Hollywood gangster nonsense, Morello was running it like a medieval warlord with counterfeit cash and throat-slitting. Ignazio Lupo, the wolf, smooth dresser, businessman on the surface, absolute psycho underneath. Imagine opening a fancy olive oil market and secretly using it as Mafia headquarters for extortion and counterfeit money. Yelp reviews probably would have been complicated. Joseph Petrosino, one of the only cops in New York actually trying to do his damn job while everybody else was busy looking the other way. Petrosino hunted Mafia figures across continents before International Task Force became a TV show buzzword. The guy basically speed-ran anti-Mafia work with a death wish. Giuseppe Masseria, Joe the Boss. Aggressive, greedy, stubborn, and completely incapable of leaving well enough alone. The kind of guy who walked into every room like he already owned the building, even if somebody else paid for it. Salvatore Maranzano, the mustached Sicilian Caesar who tried turning the Mafia into the Roman Empire with titles, hierarchy, and ego the size of Manhattan. Smart guy. Tiny problem, though, everybody around him was also a murderer.
In this life, everybody's got an ending. Some endings are loud. Some are quiet. Some you see coming. The question isn't if it happens. It's how you leave things behind. At Last Walk Insurance, we specialize in final arrangements. No paperwork. No delays. No questions. Messages delivered. Loose ends tied up. Respect handled properly. Because when your time comes, you don't want confusion. You want control. You want to go out like a man. Last Walk Insurance. Dignity delivered. Don't leave it to chance.
Trying to shoot down angels, they're trying to pull their wings off so they can't fly. And oh, but she's so brave though, just like a tornado. She's taking us by storm. You can't stop the girl from going. You can't stop the world from knowing the truth will set you free. They're trying to take our voices, they're trying to make our choices, so we scream loud, loud, loud. And oh, I know you feel the lightning, and it's so exciting, so here we come. You can't stop the girl from going. You can't stop the world from knowing the truth will set you free. Know you feel the lightning, it's so exciting, so here we come.